Chapter 2. Jack. "Do you see anybody?" asked Mandy as she and James peered through the tall iron gates at Hobart's corner. James shook his head and gave Blackie's leash a tug, trying to give him to heel. But Blackie had other ideas. He was busy sniffling the grass, searching out all sorts of interesting smells. "I can see a car," James said, "but the moving truck is gone. Blackie, behave!" "He can't help it," said Mandy, smiling down at the gangly black puppy. "He's growing up so fast and there's so much for him to learn. He's interested in everything." "I guess so," said James, his eyes still on the house. "I always thought that the house looked really spooky." Mandy looked at the tall, dark building. The paint on the window frames was peeling, and the garden was badly overgrown. "That's just because it's been empty so long," she said. "Dad says the last person to live in it was an old army captain. He moved away 5 years ago to live with his daughter." "I don't remember him," said James. "We were only little," Mandy said. "His name was Captain Hobart. That's why this was called Hobart's Corner." Blackie gave a muffled bark and began to scrabble at the bottom of the gate. "What now?" asked James, picking him up. But Mandy had seen what was attracting Blackie. "Look," she said, "there is somebody in the backyard. It looks like a little boy." "Where?" said James. Mandy pointed. "Sitting in that apple tree," she said. "He's watching us." Mandy raised her hand and waved. "Hi there," she called. "What's your name?" The boy continued to look at them, but he didn't speak. "Maybe he didn't hear you," said James. Mandy shook her head. "He heard all right," she said. "He just didn't answer." Just then a woman came around the side of the house. She was dressed in faded jeans and a baggy sweater, and her hair was tied back with a scarf. Her face was streaked with dust. "Oh, hi!" she said as she saw Mandy and James at the gate. "You haven't seen the little boy, have you?" She looked worried. "I told him not to go out of the yard. The gate wasn't open, was it?" Mandy shook her head and pointed at the boy in the apple tree. "Is that him?" she said. "Oh, there you are, Jack," said the woman. "You scared me disappearing like that." She smiled at Mandy and James, then turned back to Jack. "Come down out of there. You've got visitors." Jack scrambled down out of the tree and stood for a moment, looking at Mandy and James. He looked about 6 or 7 years old. Mandy drew in her breath when she saw his face. He had been crying. "I don't want visitors," he said. "I hate this place. I didn't want to come here. Leave me alone." And with that, he raced off across the gate and disappeared on the side of the house. Mandy and James looked at the woman, embarrassed. She smiled at them and drew a hand across her forehead. It left a long, dusty streak. "Oh dear," she said. "I wonder if this move was a good idea after all. Jack isn't happy about it." Mandy and James looked at each other. They didn't know what to say. "He'll get used to it," Mandy said at last. "Once he makes friends, Wellford's a really good place to live." The woman smiled. "I hope so," she said. Then she looked thoughtful. "He's going to start at the village school on Monday," she said. "I hope he'll be all right." James smiled. "We go there too," he said. "Tell Jack he's coming at a good time." "We've got the school picnic soon. That's always a lot of fun." "And we'll keep an eye on Jack at school if you like," said Mandy. The woman looked really grateful. "Thank you, that would be terrific," she said. Then she looked around. "I must go and find him. Goodness knows where he's run off to now." She turned away, then turned back. "I forgot to ask your names," she said. Mandy and James told her, and she smiled. "I'm Mrs. Gardner," she said. "Jack is 7. He's usually the friendliest little boy. I just hope he gets over this." She looked at Blackie at James's side. "But I don't expect seeing your puppy helped. Oh dear, we've got such a lot of work to do." Mandy and James watched as she walked away over the grass. "She seems nice," said James. Mandy nodded. "But Jack is really unhappy," she said. "Did you notice he'd been crying?" "And what did she mean about Blackie not helping?" said James. Mandy shrugged. We've got a lot to find out about the gardeners, she said, and I know the perfect place to start. Where? Said James. Grandma, said Mandy. If she doesn't know something about the gardeners, then nobody will. Grandma and Grandpa were working on their vegetable garden when Mandy and James arrived. Now you keep out of my beans, young Blackie, Grandpa said, leaning down to give Blackie a pat. Blackie looked up at him and gave a short bark. I don't know whether that's a yes or a no, Grandma said. She looked at Mandy and James. You two look as if you're bursting with news. Mandy picked up a hoe and began to weed between the lines of beans. It's the new people at Hobart's Corner, she said. They've got a little boy, but he seems really unhappy. Grandma nodded and leaned on her hoe. I went there this afternoon with some cookies, she said. Nobody ever moves in around here without a plate of your grandma's cookies to help them along, Grandpa said with a wink. You know how it is, said Grandma. Unpacking makes people hungry. And what did you find out about the gardeners? Mandy asked. Grandma shook her head. They've decided to do a lot of work on that house, she said. They're hoping to turn it into a country guest house. But Hobart's Corner's falling apart, said James. Grandma nodded. It seems Mr. Gardner is going to fix it up. Wow, said Mandy. That'll take forever. And that isn't their only problem, Grandma said. Little Jack didn't want to move in the first place, especially just after his dog died. What? Said Mandy, looking up from her hoeing. Grandma nodded. It was really sad, she said. He had a dog named Fred, but Fred got very sick and died just before they moved here. That's awful, said James, looking down at Blackie. He bent down and gave the dog a cuddle. I know how I'd feel if anything happened to Blackie. That explains why Mrs. Gardner said seeing Blackie would upset him, said Mandy. Oh, poor Jack, no wonder he's so unhappy. Grandma looked at her. Maybe you could try to make friends with him, she said. Mandy nodded. Of course we will, she said. But we can't force him to be friends, said James. He doesn't seem to want us around. Mandy looked thoughtful. What if Jack had another pet, she said. Nobody could be unhappy if they had a pet to look after. Grandpa looked doubtful. It might be difficult to replace Jack's dog, he said. Mandy shook her head. I wasn't thinking about replacing Fred, she said. I was just thinking about Jack having a new kind of pet. Like what? Asked James. Mandy frowned. I don't know yet, she said. I'll think about it. I'll have to find out what Jack is like. How will you do that if he won't even talk to you? Said James. Mandy shrugged. I'll think of a way, she said. Once he has a pet to care for, a pet that will love him back, he'll be much happier. You'll see.